dawn crawls over Donetsk, the color of gunmetal, flattening the fields into a dull sheen. Out beyond the tree line, engines mutter. A Russian armoured column nudges forward across the stubbled earth north of Avdiivka, along the Dopilya Shakov corridor, its T-72B3s and BMP-2s waddling in that heavy, confident way tanks have before the world reminds them they're very large, very visible, and very mortal. Motorcycles buzz like horseflies along the flanks. A couple quad bikes kick dust. The crews can't see it, but they're already inside a kill box, a geometry traced not on a paper map, but live in the sky by a chain of Ukrainian eyes. Quads up high, FPVs prowling low, artillery waiting for coordinates like a sprinter on the blocks. 15 to 20 kilometers out, the column first pinged the Ukrainian grid. By the time the lead tank's track clinks onto a lane they think they've cleared, the swarm is already awake and angry. The first FPV slips in like a swallow and kisses the top armor of a BMP. The detonation doesn't boom, it punches, a curt shock. Then a second drone dives, then a third, and the curtain lifts on a very old play, rewritten for 2025. For 3 hours, between 5:30 and 8 a.m. on the 16th of October, the Russians push. 22 armoured vehicles in total roll or rattle into the fight. The biggest subcolumn, 11 machines, leaving Malinivka near 0750, angling toward Shakov. A tidy tactical idea on paper: seize the village, widen the salient, threaten Pokrovsk's lifelines. In practice, it's a parade through a mine orchard, with Ukrainian drone spotters counting cadence. 2 vehicles are flagged and deleted by artillery and FPV strike teams from the Unmanned Systems Forces. More attempt to maneuver and find themselves lured into pre-registered lanes. By mid-morning, the numbers tell the story. 9 Russian vehicles destroyed, at least 4 more crippled, and the rest nosing back through smoke they made themselves. There's no poetry in a burning BMP, but there is a lesson. The battlefield no longer forgives anything slow, loud, tall, or linear. Not when every hedgerow has a lens, and every lens has a warhead attached by 5.8 gigahertz and spite. On the ground, chaos isn't cinematic, it's cramped. A platoon leader yells over a crushed comnet. A driver tries to back a tracked vehicle that suddenly handles like it's on ice. On the crest line to the south, a Ukrainian tablet blinks red icons as a fire direction center slices the column into digestible targets. FPVs buzz in from odd angles, hunting exhaust vents, turret rings, and engine decks. The Russians brought motorcycles to outrun mines and drones. It turns out you can't outrun a joystick. By the time the smoke lifts, the casualty picture hardens. 70 to 100 Russian KIA, depending on which tally you trust, with Ukrainian brigades dryly noting motorcycles among the losses. If there's a medal for learning nothing, this brigade just earned it, with oak leaves and crossed steering wheels. OSINT feeds light up like a switchboard. Deep State's map marks the failed thrust. Frontelligence threads pull apart the pacing and spacing errors. Geo-confirmed pins the wrecks on satellite tiles. Ukraine weapons tracker catalogues twisted hulls and torched tracks. Even Russian mill bloggers admit the column was spotted and savaged well short of any defensible line. An ambush you could see coming if you had a drone. And in 2025, everyone does. This isn't the first disaster here. It's the third such armoured faceplant in a week around Pokrovsk. The shape repeats. A massed push, an early detection, a drone-led mauling, then artillery and mines finishing the job. In older wars, you'd call it rash bravery. In this war, you call it poor emissions control and a failure to respect the hive. Pull the camera back and the pattern stares back at you. 20th century armor tactics are dying in a sky that belongs to cheap, plentiful sensors and disposable strike drones. Ukraine is buying and building millions of FPVs. Russia is too. Both sides jam, spoof, and hunt in the electromagnetic spectrum, and every kilometre is a conversation between antennas. Analysts now talk about drones causing north of half, sometimes closer to 2/3, of frontline losses in men and materiel. Robot spotters replace scouts. Kamikaze quads stand in for gun lines. Your old playbook still has pages, but the margins are full of lethal footnotes. It's not that tanks are obsolete, it's that tanks need a cloak, and most armies still dress them in parade blues. Even the way assaults start has mutated. Before, you hid in trees and fog. Now you hide in the noise. Overlaid jammers, spoofed GPS, deceptive movement. That every added watt is a flare in the ether, and the other side's masts are listening. Ukraine's drone operators coordinate corridors through their own electronic warfare, so their FPVs don't get swatted by friendly static. Russia threads fiber optic umbilicals onto drones that don't care about jamming at all. Both innovations tilt the field against anything bulky and predictable. This is what mechanized assault looks like when the sky is a sensor and the ground is a mine. You either disaggregate and creep, or you burn in daylight. And if you insist on forming columns in open country in front of Pokrovsk in October 2025, the math will still be there when you arrive. So what does the 16th of October failure near Shakov mean strategically? For Russia, it's confirmation that the Pokrovsk push, already a meat grinder of infantry, can't reliably transition to breakthrough operations with armor unless the drone layer is torn open first. For Ukraine, it's proof of concept that layered reconnaissance, rapid-tasked FPV flights, and old-fashioned artillery still outduel a battalion-sized rush, if the network holds. For both, it's a warning. Whoever wins the spectrum wins the ground, and the spectrum is cheaper to buy than a tank. Meanwhile, somewhere in a staff meeting, a colonel stabs the map with a pen and says, "Next time, more tanks." Somewhere else, a sergeant with a soldering iron smiles and says, "Next time, more drones." Only one of them is getting what they want at scale. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, a different kind of column is moving, lines of nervous words. In Moscow, the rhetoric spirals. Sergei Lavrov warns of a real war waged by NATO and the EU, then insists Russia has no intent to attack Europe, then promises a decisive response to any aggression. The oscillation isn't subtle. Saber rattling in one breath, reassurance in the next, threat in the third. Look at a map, and the reason hums like that FPV motor. Kaliningrad. Russia's western exclave, wedged between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic, is a fortress that increasingly feels like an island. Militarized, watched, hemmed in, and politically brittle. If Donetsk shows Moscow's armored tactics fraying, Kaliningrad shows something more dangerous. The empire's grip loosening at the fingertips. Lavrov's chorus about NATO plots isn't new, but the volume is. Part of it is external pressure. NATO commanders have gone on record saying that if it ever came to it, the alliance could seize Kaliningrad in a time frame that is unheard of. That's not PR, it's a signal. Kaliningrad is small, encircled by NATO, and mapped down to the last radar pulse. It's also bristling with S-400s, Iskanders, coastal defense missile batteries, and electronic warfare nests that make Baltic flight planners sweat. The more Moscow talks about a Western invasion, the more it sounds like what it is: propaganda panic used to mask a vulnerability that can't be fixed with a speech at the UN. Inside the exclave, the fortress narrative collides with economic isolation. Sanctions choked the easy cross-border trade that tied Kaliningrad's markets to Poland and Lithuania. Transit regimes were tweaked, ferries subsidized, logistics rerouted, but the friction remains. It costs more to move things in, it takes longer, and every delay reminds residents that Moscow is far away and Brussels is close. Analysts tracking the region's economy call out energy vulnerability and chronic dependence on routes the Kremlin can't fully control anymore. A pressure point, in other words, that grinds on day 0 and day 1000 alike. And as the economy strains, the information space pulses. Independent researchers parsing Russian Telegram audiences find pro-government channels dominating. Yet the cracks show, especially in peripheries where European radio, language, and lifestyles leak across borders like light through curtains. Kaliningrad has always had one foot in Europe's living room. Now the foot taps. It's messy-proof, not clean poles, but we can measure the mood in odd places. Emigration stories, local gripes about prices and permits, satirical memes about Moscow's bans from 1,200 kilometers away. The Kremlin's response is classic: amplify external threat to drown out internal discontent. It's a loud song. The neighbors are not impressed. Then there's the hardware. Big, round, and very nervous looking. Satellite sleuths spent the summer watching a colossal circular antenna complex take shape near Cherniakovsk, a 1.6-kilometer wide CDAA, the kind of Wulenweber array Cold War buffs whisper about. It sits roughly 25 kilometers from Poland's border, a metal mandala tuned for signals intelligence and long-wave ears. Moscow frames it as vigilance. To everyone else, it reads as fear, a monument to paranoia you can see from space. If the fortress can't afford surprise, it builds a radar that makes surprise harder and tells the world how afraid it is of being surprised. Propaganda aside, there's a political subplot that keeps resurfacing like a bad chorus. In 2023, exiled activists hosted an online referendum in which 72% of participating accounts, not the population, the participants, clicked for independence for Königsberg, as Kaliningrad's pre-Soviet name is still used in some circles. That's not a legally meaningful vote, it's internet theater, but theater matters when people start quoting the lines. Sober think tankers and NGOs note a growth of anti-Moscow sentiment in the exclave's discourse. Not a tidal wave, but a riptide, nudging the conversation away from inevitability and toward what if. The Kremlin can jail a blogger, it can't delete a mood. Put these threads together: Lavrov's escalatory language, NATO's newfound bluntness, the antenna forest, the sanctions grind, the independence chatter, and Kaliningrad becomes less fortress, more fulcrum, a place both sides circle with different kinds of power. Russia with missiles and masts, NATO with plans and patience, locals with eyes on prices and passports. That fulcrum tilts differently after weeks like this one. When your army is losing columns in Donetsk to swarms of $500 drones, your propaganda about invaders at the gate lands a little flatter. When your ears in the Baltic are the size of a small town, your neighbors don't think confidence, they think nervous, and nerves are contagious. Back to the battlefield for a moment, because that's where the echoes begin. Russia's 3 failed mechanized assaults near Pokrovsk in 1 week aren't just tactical duds, they're strategic invoices. Replacing scorched armor is slow. Replacing trained crews is slower. You can pull T-72s out of storage and weld on cope cages, but every FPV pilot you train makes those cages look like costume jewelry. Watch enough columns die on approach, and your formations adapt in the only way they can. Break into smaller packets, creep at night, let infantry seep forward under drone umbrellas, and even then, every movement is a coin flip against EW and mines. Attrition isn't just blood and steel, it's imagination running out of road. And imagination, oddly, is Kaliningrad's story too. The exclave was the Soviet imagination made stone, a Prussian city knocked down and rebuilt as a Western watchtower. For years, Moscow sold it as a triumph of will and weapons. But will is hard to ship, and weapons don't fill shelves. Families remember when a weekend to Gdansk was a quick drive. They can count the extra days a pilot now spends at sea. Boys grow up under S-400 shadows. They also grow up listening to European pop and scrolling European prices. You can drape a garrison flag over that friction and call it patriotism. You can't make the math change. Meanwhile, NATO planners are no longer coy. Exercises tie together the Suwalki Gap, Polish air policing, Lithuanian territorial defense, Swedish and Finnish integration, and quiet mapping flights that harvest every radar pulse over the Baltic. The message is not "we're coming," it's "we know you," which is why a US 4-star felt comfortable saying the quiet part out loud. Kaliningrad could be neutralized fast if needed. The irony is sharp. The more Moscow fortifies the exclave against a siege that isn't coming, the more it advertises the one thing it can't afford: how quickly a siege would end. So what ties burning armor near Shakov to nervous speeches about the Baltic? Competence, and the lack of it. A state that can't keep a 22-vehicle assault from turning into a scrapyard in under 3 hours is a state that struggles to keep a restive exclave feeling secure and supplied. Drone warfare exposes not only bad tactics, but brittle systems. Logistics stretched, EW deconfliction messy, command slow to absorb pain and change. Kaliningrad's politics tell the same truth in civilian clothes. Supply chains rerouted awkwardly, information brittle, reflexes stuck on blame NATO. The same leadership running the same loops of denial. Different theater, same plot. There's a temptation to smirk at columns exploding and to meme radar arrays into Bond villain layers. Resist it, mostly. War is tragedy before it's spectacle. Still, a little gallows humor slips through because the contrasts write their own punchlines. Motorbikes versus mines, quad bikes versus quadcopters. At this point, the drone operators are basically traffic cops with explosives, waving vehicles into no parking zones forever. And as for Kaliningrad, if the giant antenna is a symbol, it isn't strength. It's a 1.6 kilometer wide stress ball, squeezed every time a NATO AWACS circles, and the laptops in Chernihikovsk light up like pinball. The serious bottom line is simpler. In Donetsk, Ukraine proved again that the side stitching sensors to shooters faster wins the minute. In Kaliningrad, NATO has spent years stitching maps to plans, and Moscow knows it. The Kremlin can talk about real war and decisive responses all it wants. Language will not turn minefields into avenues or ferries into railways. And if the empire's control is measured by how well it moves columns and calms provinces, the week of the 16th of October 2025 offered an uncomfortable audit. Columns burned, provinces bristled, the center shouted, the periphery listened, and rolled its eyes. So where does this go? On the front line, expect Russia to keep probing around Pokrovsk, with smaller, EW-shielded packets and more infantry, because pride won't let it quit, and the calendar won't conjure more tanks. Expect Ukraine to keep widening the drone gap, pouring FPVs into kill zones, and teaching artillery to dance to their tune. In the Baltic, expect louder Russian warnings and more electronic ears, but also quieter cracks inside the exclave, as prices bite and passports itch. Expect NATO to keep saying less and planning more. None of that makes a neat ending, but strategy rarely does. It just makes the next page harder to turn. And yet, amid the noise, a clean line emerges. Armies win by adapting faster than they break. Empires endure by convincing the edges that the center still matters. Right now, Ukrainian drone crews are rewriting the first law, and Kaliningrad's residents are quietly testing the second. If Moscow can't change the way it fights or the way it governs its farthest shore, the battlefield and the Baltic will keep teaching the same lesson in different languages. From the mud of Donetsk to the Baltic coast, the empire that once marched on steel now fights to hold on to sand.